Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. You know, when you think about it, humanity has gone through this massive shift. We went from being just, well, subjects ruled by absolute monarchs to actually being active citizens who hold the power. So today, we are going to unpack the actual mechanics of that power. We'll look at the different operating systems that nations use and really get into why a single document, the Constitution, acts as the ultimate source code for a fair society. Now, picture this for a second. Imagine playing your absolute favorite sport. Could be soccer, basketball, cricket, whatever. But there are zero rules. No out of bounds, no fouls, literally no referees on the field. What happens? Right, it devolves into total chaos in about 2 minutes. Well, societies operate on that exact same principle. Without a governing framework to set the rules and settle disputes, our daily lives would look a lot like that chaotic match. So, to prevent that kind of everyday chaos, functional governments rely on three main pillars. Think of them as the crucial staff in our sports analogy. First, you have the legislative branch. They're the ones actually writing the rulebook. Then there's the executive branch. They're on the ground, making sure those rules are implemented. And finally, the judicial branch. They act as the referee, stepping in to interpret the laws and, just making sure everything stays fair. Section 1. Who holds the power? Comparing the different games of governance around the world. Let's get into it. Because the game of governance changes completely depending on a country's operating system. In a democracy, you and I, the citizens, we hold the power. We elect our leaders and our rights are protected. But in a monarchy, that power is usually inherited by a king or queen. Dictatorships, on the other hand, consolidate absolute power into a single leader or a very small group, and they maintain that through force, with zero public input. And then you have a theocracy, where religious leaders govern directly based on sacred texts. Now, consider the extreme here. What might happen if an absolute monarch considered themselves to have literal divine powers? When a ruler genuinely believes they answer to no earthly law, well, earthly rules suddenly become pretty irrelevant. This inevitably leads to arbitrary rule. Citizens become powerless, dissent is treated as treason, and that kind of unchecked power, it becomes inherently incredibly dangerous. Which brings us to Section 2, the democratic difference. We're taking a closer look at freedom, equality, and choice. To really grasp this, we have to contrast the stark reality of a dictatorship with a democracy. Take a look at a citizen named Shane, living in North Korea under a strict dictatorship. Everyday life is entirely micromanaged by the state. We're talking mandatory military service, heavily restricted internet, state-mandated clothes, and just constant surveillance. But in a democracy, you have the freedom of choice. You have free speech, elected leaders, and an independent judiciary there to protect your rights. It's literally the gap between living in fear and living with actual agency over your own life. And the absolute cornerstone of that true democracy is something called universal adult franchise. This is a massive equalizer. It's the principle that every single adult citizen, regardless of their wealth, their gender, their caste, or religion, has an equal right to vote. And what's incredibly significant historically is that India, despite being incredibly vast and diverse, implemented this right from day one of independence. They completely bypassed the decades-long waiting periods that we saw in a lot of other nations. And these democratic ideals, they aren't just modern Western imports. They are deeply rooted in ancient Indian civilizational values, like the concept of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which translates to the world is one family. Even thousands of years ago, early Indian republics, like the Vaji Mahajanapada, were actually utilizing assemblies to solve issues collectively. So this historical DNA of tolerance and shared humanity really laid the perfect groundwork for a modern democratic state. Moving on to Section 3, the ultimate rulebook, drafting the blueprint for a fair society. So that ultimate rulebook we've been talking about, that's the Constitution. It acts as the actual blueprint for the entire nation. It's so much more than just a list of laws. It explicitly codifies the exact relationship between the government and the people. It clearly outlines what the state can and absolutely cannot do, ensuring that power is always checked and that your rights are secured. Now, drafting this colossal framework was absolutely no small feat. Back in 1946, the Constituent Assembly gathered representatives from incredibly diverse backgrounds all across India. And after nearly 3 years of really intense debate and compromise, they officially adopted the document on November 26, 1949. It then went into full effect on January 26, 1950, officially giving birth to the world's largest written constitution. And during those intense debates, there were some truly profound moments that shaped the nation's soul. Just listen to this quote from Begum Azaz Rasool in 1949. She proudly stated, "Sir, the women of India are happy to step into their rightful heritage of complete equality with men in all spheres of life and activity." She pointed out that this wasn't even a brand new concept, but rather an ancient Indian ideal of equality that had just degraded over time and was now officially being restored and guaranteed by law. Section 4, Pillars of the Constitution, a living, breathing document for a modern nation. The Constitution's preamble establishes these massive, towering ideals: justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, and secularism. But I want to emphasize that these aren't just abstract, high-level concepts. They show up in our daily lives. Secularism, for example, means you can celebrate your diverse religious festivals without the state interfering. Justice and equality mean you actually have equal opportunity in the job market, regardless of your gender or background. These pillars are actively working every single day to hold up our everyday freedoms. But here's the thing. A completely rigid rulebook would eventually just snap under the pressure of a changing world. That's why the Constitution is fundamentally a living document. Look at recent steps. In 2016, the 101st Amendment modernized the economy by introducing the Goods and Services Tax, or GST. Then, the 103rd Amendment in 2019 addressed shifting socioeconomic realities by providing a 10% reservation for economically weaker sections. It literally adapts to reality to make sure the game stays fair. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty big question to think about. Have we as a society truly achieved all the ideals of the Constitution yet? Because while the rulebook itself is incredibly strong, real-world challenges like inequality and corruption definitely still persist. The Constitution gives us the perfect framework, absolutely, but the game is still being played. Ensuring justice, liberty, and equality requires our constant civic duty and participation. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I hope you walk away looking at the rules of our society in a whole new light.